The Archon War, a war where numerous gods fought over the division of Tevat and for the title of Archon. The world must have been quite interesting if there were so many gods. There is literally a god of dust and a god of salt. Except that's not exactly correct. In the original Chinese, the war was fought to become a god. The term Archon is only used in the Western localizations of the game. None of these quote-unquote gods are actually gods in the traditional theist sense. Welcome to Genshin Impact Lost in Translation. The word for god or deity is shen in Mandarin Chinese. You may have heard of the word in Japanese, kami. The term for the archons in-game is qi shen or shijin, using the words for seven and god. So the archons are actually just gods in the original language. In the English localization, archons are essentially considered as a special type of god, and the Archon War was fought between regular gods. The Archon War in Chinese is Mo Shen Zanzhen, or Majin Senso in Japanese. Zanzhen is war. The Shen in Mo Shen is god. The Mo character is used for magic, Mo Fa, and demon or devil, Mo. Mo Shen put together would likely be translated literally as either magical god or demon god by most people. You could potentially also consider terms such as Jin or proto-god, or even magical divinity, divine magus. And by Jin, I mean in the traditional sense, not the Genshin Jin. So the Archon War was actually a war between these proto-divine entities. The victors of said war then became regular god, per se, along with gaining membership of the Seven. This is an important distinguishing factor because it provides information on timelines and identities. For example, Morax is referred to as the Lord of Geo, God of Geo, and Geo Archon, all pretty interchangeably in English. If you've seen my previous video, you would know that several meanings in his name are lost in translation. There are points where Morax is called Yanzhi Mosen, or Iwan no Majin, i.e., Demon God of Geo. English has translated this as Geo Archon, but through the original language, we can see that this was before he became the actual god of Geo. There are also implications on power scaling and hierarchy between beings. Going with the logic that a pure god is a superior being compared to a demon god, the incentive of attaining godhood makes sense as one of the motivators for the Archon War. There are some angels in game that are also referred to as gods, such as Nabu Malikata, the Lord of the Night, and Zibai. There is potentially an argument to be made here that the origin of the divine entity's power links with this difference in classification, because these three are simply Shen, not more Shen. In other words, pure gods. You can contrast this with other so-called gods such as Osail and Deshret, who are more Shen. You may then wonder, is there a way to actually differentiate between Shen and more Shen easily when not playing in Chinese, Japanese, or Korean? Unfortunately, not really. However, the naming of these more Shen themselves can sometimes be a useful indicator of separating them from regular gods if you know what to look for. You may remember that all the Archons have a formal name beyond their personal ones. You know Barbatos and Morax, A who is Beelzebul, Nahida who is Bua, etc. These names are often referred to as goetic names, but even beyond the Archons, the other more Shen have such names too. For example, Guizong is Hargentus, Deshret is Amun. If you're into your demonology, you would recognize that these names that all the more Shen have are demon names derived from famous grimoires, notably the Ars Goetia from the Lesser Key of Solomon, hence goetic name. The naming of demon gods makes a lot more sense when you take this context into consideration. The 72 demons from the Ars Goetia are referred to as 所罗门72柱魔神 in Chinese, which translates to Solomon's 72 demon pillars. You can see here that the demons are called Mo Shen. Hence translating Mo Shen to demon god rather than magic god is more accurate. But wait, I hear you say, the Pyro Archons weren't Mo Shen, they were human. Yes, having a goetic name does not necessarily mean that the named individual is an actual demon god. However, think of it from this perspective. All of the Pyro Archons share this name Haburim. Xabalanqi, as a human before, would not have had this name, so the implication is that it was granted after becoming a victor of the Archon War. And since this was the Mo Shen War, where the original participants were all supposed to be these demon gods, is it perhaps not appropriate that a victor who came out on top would receive a name that is of equal power to those other demon gods, considering they would be transcending that level by becoming an actual god? Considering the power that names have, there's a whole other theory that can be delved into there. Anyway, besides sometimes helping to identify demon gods, what also makes this interesting is that the shades too have names that derive from one of these demons. If considering the aforementioned origin of power and the relation to naming, there is a potential theory to be made here that the heavenly principles is capable of creating such proto-divine entities and elevating them to the status that transcends the power of a regular god. An alternative interpretation is that a demon god, once ascended to a true god, is then also in a position to become a superior ruler like a shade if certain conditions are met. But that is also a whole other separate theory on elemental life forms of Teyvat and their origin of power. There's also the eternal question of what the heck is Paimon, who also has one of these demon names. Some people like to theorize that she is some sort of incarnation of Asmodee, but since these two have separate demon names, I'm more inclined to think that Paimon is a completely separate entity. Anyhow, on the topic of a demon god becoming a regular god, for a more Sun to become just a Sun, you need a gnosis, a heart of God, which is literally what the text is in Chinese and Japanese, 神之心, or kami no kokoro. This naming format draws parallels with visions, which are eyes of God, 神之眼, or kami no me. The word gnosis comes from the Greek word for knowledge. In English, it generally refers to the knowledge of spiritual mysteries. An important link here is Gnosticism, the group of religious and philosophical movements that are centered around the idea of this special knowledge, or gnosis. Aside from this inner spiritual knowledge, another key principle of Gnosticism is the concept of having a pure supreme being, that would be God with the capital G, and a lesser, flawed creator deity called the Demiurge. Does that concept sound familiar? Yes, there are several parallels that can be drawn to the Genshin hierarchy under the heavenly principles. The supreme god in Gnosticism is known as the monad, or the one. You could argue that this is what the heavenly principles represents. You could also interpret this as being Nibelung if you look at it from the old world perspective. Underneath the monad are the aeons, divine emanations that are expressions of the monad. In-game, this would map to the shades, governing the rules of Teyvat. Out of these aeons, there's the final emanation of God, called Sophia, or wisdom. Sophia is described as one who acted independently, in other words, disobedient. You can draw parallels with Asmodee, who is currently missing, or alternatively, you can also link this with the angels in-game, who were created by the heavenly principles but eventually cursed. From Sophia, then comes the Demiurge, the creator of the physical world. Depending on whether you think Sophia is represented by Asmodee or the angels, there are multiple entities that potentially draw inspiration from the Demiurge. For instance, the Lord of the Night, or Celes in general. You could also argue that the power over space itself, held by Asmodee, is the creator of the material world. Under the Demiurge comes the most prominent link to the game, the Archons. The term Archon is used directly in Gnosticism. However, the original word comes from the Greek archon, or ruler, generally referring to the 9 chief magistrates in ancient Athens. In Gnosticism, there are usually 7 archons, just like there are 7 in Genshin. These 7 archons, known as Hebdomad, are associated with celestial planets and are considered the demonic rulers of the material world. Essentially, they maintain the order of the mortal material world but keep souls trapped in ignorance. The physical world that we normal humans experience is the flawed realm and is seen as an imperfect distortion of the divine, which restricts the divine spark contained within each person. There is then supposed to be some savior figure who will enlighten humanity by bringing gnosis, this hidden spiritual knowledge that is the means of salvation. That sounds awfully a lot like Descenders in Genshin, doesn't it? Only the third Descender messed up somewhere and was instead chopped into pieces. And whilst the gnosis formed from their remains still became something that could make a being into a god, these gods come with a whole bunch of terms and conditions linked directly to Celestia. There's also the perspective from classical astronomy, where each of the archon's corresponding planet is associated with a celestial sphere, with a sphere of fixed stars above that. In order to reach the supercelestial regions, i.e. beyond the celestial spheres of the 7 heavens, the human souls need gnosis. This region above the control of the archons is called the Ogdoad, and depending on which Gnostic text you read, is where Sophia resides. In-game, you could interpret this as being just celestial literally, given that is where the shades are. But if you subscribe to the Asmodee is based off Sophia interpretation, then this actually fits with the Temple of Space. Since Celestia itself is in theory accessible by any ascended god, Asmodee's Temple of Space, with the human NPCs that are essentially experiencing a form of salvation and not easily accessible by other gods, mirrors the elements of the 8th Sphere more. Anyway, religious parallels aside, you may have noticed that one of the so-called planets listed earlier includes the moon. If we had to map each Genshin archon to an actual Gnostic archon, I would probably assign the moon to Nahida, given her moon motifs and the fact that the moon was considered to be the closest to the Earth, i.e. the lowest sphere, there are connotations of immediate control over the material world, which I think ties quite nicely with the Dendro Archon's role concerning Irminsul. So what about the actual moon then, the moon goddesses in game? From a language perspective, the moon divinity is an outlier in the localizations. The three moon sisters and Columbina are referred to as Yue Shen in Chinese, using the characters for moon and god. In Chinese and Japanese, all of the archons can be referred to by the respective element and the character for god. For example, the anemo archon is Feng Shen or Fu Jing, using the characters for wind and god. The geo archon is Yin Shen, and the electro archon is Lei Shen, and so on. Following this exact same pattern is the Yue Shen. So if they were keeping the archon naming convention, the so-called moon goddesses would actually be something like moon archon or lunar archon. You can see that this implies that in the original language, there's no actual distinguishing factor in the naming between the archons and the moon goddesses. They are all just Shen. The use of the archon terminology in English helps to highlight the membership of the seven, rather than divine status. There is also an interesting language quirk in that the moon goddesses are actually referred to as goddesses in English, using the female term for deities, whereas the other archons, despite the gender they present as, are all referred to using the masculine or neutral god. A is called the god of eternity, Nahida is the god of wisdom. This suggests there is an emphasis on the capitalized form of god in the traditional theist sense. Languages that are more strict with the grammatical gender are less consistent here. For instance, in French, the term déesse is actually used in place of Dieu sometimes. Nabu Malikata is also an outlier. She is called the goddess of flowers even in English. The Chinese is Hua Shen, using the characters for flower. So just like the moon goddesses, you could go with flower archon, which would contrast with Nahida's Cao Shen, translated as dendro archon, but literally meaning grass god. You may wonder after all of this, does it really matter that demon god is lost in translation? If you are thinking about power scaling and the implications the power of a god has to the world of Teyvat, then what actually matters is not that demon god is lost in translation, but rather there's no other way to distinguish true gods. As mentioned previously, besides the moon goddesses, some of the other true gods include some angels. We know that Nabu Anikata is referred to as the goddess of flowers, while Zibai is the god of grain and soil. But the Lord of the Night, who, by the way, does not actually have a name in Chinese, loses her literal divine naming in the Western localizations. Yohuatekuten is referred to as Ye Shen in Chinese, using the characters for night and god. This was localized as Lord of the Night, and the name Yohuatekuten was added to align with the Aztec and Mayan naming scheme for the Natlan region. However, if you do not know anything about Mesoamerican religions, then it is not immediately obvious from the name alone that the Lord of the Night is an actual deity. And whilst Yohuatekuten does also have a bunch of other titles and aliases, just like most other divine beings, none of them reference any words used for divinities. Whether or not someone is just a Shen has implications in law, since names are important to fate, so the ambiguity in some of the localizations does not help this. For example, the everlasting lord of arcane wisdom, with the electronosis, is considered a god, Shoki no Kami, or Zhenji Zhishen, the god of salvation, whereas the Tori with his artificial moons is considered a heretic, despite his ambitions to transcend the divine. So the definition of a god is important, and it also affects other terms too, one of these being god remains. Thinking about the Morsen as demon gods brings sinister connotations to the concept of god remains. The term god remains is localized from Morsen Canza in Chinese. The phrase Canza is a bit more weighted than just remains. Individually, Can can mean ruin or cruel, and all of these things. Za can mean dregs or waste, and all of these. Whilst put together, it can mean remains or residue. Compared to other terms that carry the same translation of remains, this character choice has a lot more negative connotations. Ominous meanings aside, the point I would like to raise here is the fact that it is more Shen Canza and not just Shen Canza. The implication here is that demon god remains are what is problematic, i.e., if a regular god died, the resulting aftermath would be different. Think about Zibai's death. Did her people get turned into grain like Havria's were turned into salt? No, they lived and went on to join what would eventually become Li Yue. Yes, she was technically preserved by Istaroth, but that was her soul split in three, not her physical form. You could, of course, argue that gods don't have a concrete physical form in the first place, but then what exactly are god remains? And this is exactly where I'm heading with this. It is not actually god remains, but demon remains. Xiao's karmic debt that is slowly killing him, the stuff Kole was injected with that caused all her suffering, the crystal marrow used to manufacture delusions, all these had negative consequences, because the remains of a demon are inherently evil. A potential way to think of this is that once a proto-divine entity is no longer alive, or physically present in the realm due to being sealed, then the divine element is also gone. So a demon god, without the god part, is simply a demon. In other words, with the sun gone from Mo Sun, the remaining Mo is the component of their power, since this character also means magic. Lingering elemental power and festering negative emotions from the loss of life or active will, without a divine god controlling this anymore, the demonic power rises, leading to harmful consequences that cannot simply be replaced by non-divine powers. All of this basically is to say that the true sun or divine is what upholds the foundations and stability of Teyvat. The title of the game is taken from the Japanese Genshin. In Chinese, this is Yuan Shen, using the characters for origin and god. The term Yuan Shen itself in-game is localized as Allogene, which is taken from the Gnostic text Allogenes. The term can also mean primordial god or original god. There's an interesting contrast here between demon gods, because the implication is that a primordial god already has the fundamentals required to become a true god, in the sense that they are already a god, or the origins of one, to begin with. So all Allogenes in-game have the potential to ascend to Celestia and become gods, whereas the demon gods had to fight for a heart of god to become a god. The Archon quests in-game are also called Mo Shen quests, Mo Shen Renwu or Ma Jing Ning Mu. So we as the traveller, in other words, the Gnostic savior bringing Gnosis, are essentially following the stories of original gods, the Allogenes, in a world that has been greatly shaped by demon gods and their powers, in an ultimate quest to become a true god, bringing salvation to the humans of Teyvat and freeing them from the domain of the Archons, and then up the Gnostic chain of command to the Supreme Being. How the Abyss Twin fits in, also as a savior in this whole Gnostic journey, both as the narrative foil and as the alternative fate, is arguably what will become the crux of the direction of Teyvat's fate. If you found this video interesting or learned something new today, please give a thumbs up. If you have theories of your own, leave a comment down below. As always, hope you have a pleasant day wherever you are, and good luck with your polls.